Welcome to the Chase Medsearch podcast, the place where we dive deep into the medical device sales industry by discussing the current trends, timeless philosophies, and amazing experiences that shape our niche of the industry. Join me, Jordan Chase, on a guided tour as I speak with established sales leaders and professionals as they share stories that will help you get in, stay in, and thrive in your medical device sales career. Let's start the show. Welcome back to the Chase Medsearch podcast. We're starting to hit a rhythm with these podcast recordings this year, just like my Cowboys are. You can't see me since this is all audio, but I do have on the Cowboys victory polo since it's Victory Polo Monday, clinched the division, and heading into the playoffs. Very excited about that. I imagine a full 25% of the country listening to this cares about that. But anyway, I had to work it in. I'm super excited about this episode today. I have personally benefited from the skills and development and training from Development Dimensions International, and I've got two of their very best here to talk with us today about DDI. Dr. William C. Byam, CEO, co-founded Development Dimensions International with Dr. Douglas Bray of AT&T in 1970. Together, they introduced targeted selection to the corporate world over 50 years ago. Their targeted selection system goes far beyond just what to do in the interview. It's a process, an entire system for fair, accurate candidate evaluation. To simplify this topic into one sentence, targeted selection is about past behavior, predicting future behavior. And as I mentioned, today with me on the podcast, I have two of DDI's finest. Alexandra Center and Mike Cummins are our two guests. I'm super excited to discuss this topic with you two today and get under the hood of past behavior predicting future behavior and understanding the process and system for fair and accurate candidate evaluation. Let's jump in. Mike, tell us about your background first.
Sure. See if I can do this quickly for everyone. I've been with DDI for, it's coming up, let's just say I stopped counting after 25 years. And for the first 2/3 of my career, I was in a consulting role where I actually worked with a lot of different clients around implementing solutions like targeted selection, as well as our training curriculum and our testing platform. For the last 4 or 5 years, maybe even 6 at this point, I moved into a sales leadership role with the goal to try to get our sales folks to become more consultative in the way we interact with our clients. So for today's podcast, my first one, by the way, so thanks for the opportunity, Jordan. For today's podcast, I'm putting pretty much my consulting hat back on to talk a little bit about some of the stories within targeted selection from my career. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Alexandra, microphone to you. Tell us about yourself.
Hello. Thanks so much for the warm introduction, Jordan. Dallas local myself, so go Cowboys.
Yes.
So I am a leadership advisor here at DDI. I am a little less seasoned than Mike is here. So, it's really fun to get to talk to you and your audience because my background, actually, the last 7 years has been in medical sales. So I'm really excited to talk today just about the differences between how targeted selection really helped me feeling confident coming into DDI, as well as how it can really help some of your listeners with taking targeted selection into the medical space.
That's fantastic. I love just the different things that both of you are going to bring to the conversation today, anywhere from the research and understanding sort of the intentionality behind it and the science of it to the street credibility of the medical device background and med sales and healthcare sales. It's just fantastic. And I love this whole concept. And it's obviously all I do all day, so I can't wait to get into it. Maybe just to begin with, Mike, can you dive in a bit deeper and explain the process or system for us a bit more?
Process or the system. So DDI's MO, if you will, is we do a lot of different training curriculum and we help clients up their skill and leadership behaviors. A lot of those trainings happen in the course of 3 to 4 hours in a classroom situation where you get a chance to skill practice and get feedback. Behavior interviewing is done a little bit differently at DDI in that it's really more 2 half-day programs. The first half day is what we call the art of interviewing, and the second half day is about the science of interviewing. In one program, we're teaching you the basics of interviewing, things like background review, getting the right behavioral questions in place, what competencies you're looking for, and we can dive into that in a bit, I assume. And then the second half is really around how do I score this data? How do I stay calibrated? How do I integrate data with other interviewers? And so art of interviewing, science of interviewing, and we call it more of a program than we do training curriculum.
Alexandra, you mentioned in your intro, when you walked into DDI, you knew already about targeted selection. Is that right? And I'm assuming that's how they interviewed you to get you hired there.
Yeah, I'll admit coming into my DDI interview experience, I actually was not familiar with targeted selection. So this was all new to me and something that now I've really taken on and learned so much about.
Okay.
However, in the past, so DDI really was one of the first companies that I had interviewed with outside of a medical sales entity. So previously, I was always interviewing with pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, anything in that healthcare realm. Now, coming into DDI, the questions that I was asked in the interview and really digging into the examples that they were trying to get from me were so different from those questions that I had been asked in interviews previously.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of medical sales, you're being hired or promoted based on past performance or your ranking at a company. So they're going to ask you, are you meeting your goals? Have you achieved any President's Club, VIP clubs? What's your product knowledge? Who do you know in your territory? However, that's not going to predict if you're going to be successful at all competencies and duties on the job. And that is something that DDI with targeted selection did differently by asking me different questions about the competencies that they're looking at to hire for this particular position.
So you'd been interviewed obviously for sales positions before many times. And yeah, this whole process felt different to you. And we'll dive into that. How many different industries and companies use targeted selection, Mike? Rough estimate.
I have that. I'm going to say rough estimate. I'm looking up some data right now. I believe that the one tagline for DDI is that we've done work with at least 80% of the Fortune 500 companies.
Wow.
The last I looked, I think we're somewhere around right now, more than 50% of them specifically in behavior-based interviewing.
It's fantastic. Any idea on the medical niche? Let's say the biotech, pharmaceutical, medical device verticals? Rough estimate.
I don't have that off the top of my head. I'm going to say, we've worked with some of the big dogs out there.
Mm-hmm.
My background at DDI was probably for the first 10 or 15 years, I was the pharma guy, and I did a lot of competency modeling work within even medical device. So without getting into client names, I'm just going to say that we've worked with some of the bigger organizations within this industry in the past 15, 20 years for sure.
Absolutely. One of them was my former employer who got me certified in your targeted selection process. And then I turned around and taught it to a bunch of sales managers at the time. And that was a big initiative corporate wise in terms of that organization. In those years, I think they had a goal of having every manager, even sales managers, trained in it by the end of, I think it was a 2-year goal, if I remember right. It was an enormous organization. So that took a lot of work. And so I even made the journey out to Pittsburgh, as I mentioned to you guys.
That's an interesting point that I think is worth sharing with the listeners. And that is a number of organizations come to us and say, we want to put this program in place. Can we own it? And the answer to that is you absolutely can. I think you mentioned that you were actually trained to then train internally, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, that's a beautiful part. We have a whole team of adjunct facilitators that can come into an organization and do the training for you, or we can actually certify our clients to go and take it themselves, get certified to be a owner of the process, and then basically pass all the intellectual property over to you internally and let you run with at your own pace.
Yep. Yeah, that's great. That's great.
And one other unique call out there too is, Jordan, you mentioned you actually went to our home office in Pittsburgh. So you were physically in a classroom setting, and that's how you were certified. And now DDI does the majority of our work virtually. So this is now how we are training people via a virtual classroom, or we can also send one of our consultants out to do it at their own offices. So we have a little bit of flexibility there, but now we know there's so much of a lifestyle with remote working and hybrid work. And so we've really been flexible with that and listened to the audience and what they've needed. And that is more virtual classroom.
That's fantastic. I love the flexibility there. Well, let me ask you to open it up. Can an organization really ace their interview processes?
An organization or the candidate? Give me more around that question, Jordan.
Well, let's go from the organization standpoint first. Can a hiring manager ace their interview process when they're interviewing candidates?
So can I spin that question in my head? I just want to make sure I'm on the same page.
Sure.
Can I, as a certified interviewer, become better at interviewing as a result of this process? Is that what's behind this question?
Yes. And can you measurably improve outcomes in terms of hires?
So let's go to that question first. Absolutely. And we have a whole bunch of different research on our website around how we've actually done things like increased engagement or lowered turnover as a result of an organization implementing behavior-based interviewing, TS. TS, by the way, short for targeted selection for DDI. So I don't think I have the ability to sit here and quote a whole bunch of different research, but yes, we have measurable results that we can share around the impact of bringing in targeted selection.
That's fantastic. Alexandra, you're a sales manager. Put that hat on your head right now for me. And in layman's terms, describe this process to any sales manager out there listening to us. What does this process look like in terms of behavior-based interview from a tactical field manager level? Let's say some recruiter, maybe named Jordan Chase, set up 5 interviews for you in, I don't know, Newark, New Jersey or Honolulu, Hawaii, and you've got people coming in. What's it look like if you've been trained? How's this process going to run for you?
To be honest, it's all about making the interviewer and the interviewee more comfortable and confident with the questions, with the answers. So I've actually gone through targeted selection training myself. But previously to that, I had never actually done an interview that I conducted before. So I walked out of that saying, wow, I would feel comfortable and confident talking to somebody and interviewing them for DDI if I needed to. And that's because we're really taking off the hat of being biased. We're all about being unbiased. It's best if you tailor down the competencies that are needed to be successful at the particular job, and then tailor the questions around that. So we're making sure that we're asking the right questions, we're getting the right examples that are tailored strictly for the competencies that we're looking at. We're not just asking off the wall biased questions. So everybody walks away with a fair opportunity to land a role. And so therefore, it's great for the organization too, because you're asking the right questions to make sure you get the right person for the job. And this is where we use our success profiles, which Mike does a really good job explaining. And I'd love for him to jump in and tell you about those.
Absolutely. So, Mike, if I heard Alexandra right, we're talking about competency-based interviewing. And in order to know what kind of competencies you need in your organization, there has to be a little bit of discovery process there. You probably have some idea if you're a hiring manager or a leader in that organization, but there's some work to be done to develop something called a success profile against which you'll interview. Is that right?
That is correct. So I'll go and give a high-level overview of a success profile, and then we may want to back up and talk a little bit about how to build that success profile. So think about a 2x2 grid. And on the left side, in the upper left corner, you have knowledge areas. And so maybe the two of you can even help me with the different knowledge areas that a medical device salesperson might need to have. And on the bottom left of that 2x2, you have experiences. How much outside sales experience do you have? On the upper right, you have competencies, and on the bottom right, you have personal attributes, or almost how you're wired, a little bit of your DNA, personality, if you will. That, at DDI's world, is called a success profile. And what's interesting, if you think about this grid now, the left side being knowledge and experience, and the right side being competencies and personal attributes, you are correct, Jordan, that we do focus a lot of the interview around that upper right quadrant. We can gather some information around personality within an interview as well. But think about that 2x2 grid. The left side is what most organizations end up hiring candidates around, those that aren't savvy around competencies. But what's most interesting is when you have to fire somebody is typically for the right side. And so what we try to do is talk to our clients around, let's build out that full success profile. What do you expect these people to come to the table with? It's almost like, think about what you see on a resume. What are the knowledge and experiences that somebody brings to the table? That gets you the right to talk to some folks internally at an organization. Now, tell me about what you can do. What are the behaviors you demonstrate on a daily basis? Tell me about your account planning. Tell me about your business acumen. Let me ask you questions around how you qualify sales or some of your negotiation tactics, et cetera. And it's when you have a full picture of the success profile of an individual that you can make a better, more informed decision. And that way you're hiring and bringing somebody in that's going to be the right fit with the behaviors on the job.
I like how you said organizations tend to hire on the left side of that 2x2 matrix, but when they have to let somebody go or replace somebody, it's the right side. That's often the reason for why that person's not finding the success, and that's competencies.
100%.
Yeah.
Good summary.
What would you add to that, Alexandra?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in because I really want to tailor it to the medical sales audience. Jordan, you and I have spoken in the past with medical sales, and it's one of those where a lot of the time people are hired into a new company, whether it be for a new medicine or a new device, and they're usually taken over from a company that did a similar specialty.
Yeah.
So do you have a book of business? Do you know the doctors in this territory? Are you familiar with the disease state? And so they're asking them, as Mike had mentioned, with that left side, they're talking to them about the knowledge and the experience. However, it's hard to come into an office and have these conversations with a physician when you're having a new product and you really need to get under the hood with them and ask those tough hitting questions to get them to understand what this new product is that you're selling them. So if you're being interviewed and asked the right questions, and now you're having to think, how am I going to go in there and have planning and organizing with them, communication? These are more on that right side where they need to be talked about in the interview process so that they can be successful taking on this new role.
Absolutely. Great points. There's so many analogies popping off in my brain from what you're talking about, because, in medical niches that I recruit in, sometimes, for example, a spine sales rep may have lots of relationships with many of the right doctors. And yet when they transition into a neuromodulation type of job, which has a great deal more patient contact than they've ever experienced before, they may be very good with the doctor who's implanting the device. But when it comes to a lot of the patient follow-up, management, coaching doctors through reprogramming that patient, they struggle badly. And many of them find the job not to be something that they enjoy and are, and opt out. I've seen that over and over again in the course of 25 years. Even though that person walked in with lots of accolades on their resume, President's Club wins, President's Breakfast, you name it, all kinds of things. But when you really isolated it down to the factors of the job that were required in this new job, it wasn't discovered that that was not going to be something that they had been competent in, successful at before, and weren't going to like, quite honestly, which is why they didn't find the success. And that's not universally true. Of course, it's not universally true. There's many exceptions, but if we're going to generalize, that's something I've seen over and over again.
Jordan, as you were talking, it's interesting because my brain does go as a consultant down that competency path. And in that first scenario, you're probably, as your current job, really good at account planning and business acumen and technical knowledge and portfolio management. But when you talked about that new job dealing with the patients, I think you've got to throw in new behaviors that you should be interviewing around, like building trusting relationships and sustaining customer satisfaction. Those are new behaviors that are going to be required in that new job that are different from the current. Hence, that success profile would have to be adapted and then interviewing around those new behaviors to make sure the candidate has the right skills to be successful in that new world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And going off of that, it's something too where, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of medical reps are hired based on their experience. However, you can use targeted selection even when looking at promoting someone, whether that be internally or talking to external candidates as well, because it's one of those where just because somebody is blowing it out of the park with their sales and they're hitting or ranking number one at all times does not mean that they're going to be a good leader. There's going to be different behaviors that need to be looked at and questioned once we get to that. So kind of going off what Mike just mentioned, it goes in with promotions as well.
Yeah. Sounds like it's not just a tool used for external talent selection, but also internal talent selection. And you can use it. It's sort of ambidextrous like that. That's fantastic. Anybody who has been a sales manager or has at least had some level of exposure to your training talks about STAR interviewing.
Yes.
What is STAR interviewing for those that don't know?
You or me, Allie?
Take it away, Mike.
Sounds good. So STAR methodology, it goes back to what you teed up at the very beginning, Jordan, in terms of past behavior predicts future behavior. And in short, when you're in an interview and I'm asking you a question around something like, tell me about a time when you had to negotiate with a tough procurement department. I'm looking, in the end, for a STAR. And what STAR is an acronym for what was the situation or task? So give me context to your example. What was the actions you took? Give me details of what you did to handle that situation. And what was the result? Tell me what was achieved and find out whether it was an effective achievement or ineffective by asking good follow-up questions. When I do interviews, Jordan, I am actually pretty transparent with the candidate in saying, I'm looking for a STAR. and I may interrupt you. And if I do that, I'm only doing it to your advantage. And I actually explain to them what a star is to help focus them, because in the interview process, and again, this is a process, I want to make sure that I'm asking all the questions that I can to learn as much as I can about that candidate. I also want to make sure I have enough time for that candidate to ask me questions as well. So I'm a big, big believer that a well-trained interviewer can actually pull the best from a candidate. And I'm pretty transparent in my process. And I'm doing a lot of interviews right now. I actually interviewed Allie. And I'm not shy about saying, this is what I'm looking for. Here's situation, task, action, result, and getting real specific with them. Because if I can pull that star out and it's a complete star, then I now have data that says this individual has shown me a good example of what that behavior looks like on the job. And if I can gather a whole bunch of those different examples, a whole bunch of those different stars, then I can pretty much say with comfort and confidence that their past behavior is going to predict their success in their current job.
Alexandra?
Yeah, and I'll admit, previously, before interviewing at DDI, any interview I ever had, they want you to tell them stories. They want to hear about a particular instance that might relate to some challenges that will come with the job. But when I was being interviewed at DDI, I didn't know what STAR was previously. And it really does simplify what they're looking for. So if you can answer a question using the STAR method, that is clear and concise and makes it such a more professional way of what they're looking for, instead of saying a long drawn out story where they really just want to know what that result was. And naturally in an interview, you want to show your best self. So if you even can have some stars ready to go. And so that way, whenever you go into an interview, if they're using targeted selection, you can feel prepared in that you have a clear story that is to the point. And as Mike had mentioned, we always want to make sure there's time for a Q&A at the end.
Mm-hmm. That raises an interesting point to me, which I've had a little pushback here and there, not much, but occasionally a manager will say that person was too well prepared for the interview. Like they knew, or the way they think or the way they prepare themselves for interview is the START way. So I don't know if the information that I'm getting is the best because I feel like they've got the answers to the test in a sense. I'm sure you've heard that over the years. What's kind of your counter argument to that? If a candidate produces really good STAR interview answers, have you really gotten a true sense of the candidate?
Whew, that's a good one, in my opinion. It's a really good question.
That really is.
So I just, I'll share you my reaction to that. 30 years at DDI, I've hired a lot of different people. And I believe in the process. I believe in the behavioral interviewing process. And let me see if I can paint the picture. When I get an interview guide, let's just say, and let's go for a basic competency around planning and organizing. Tell me about a time when you had multiple conflicting tasks. How did you handle it? Tell me about how you handle a given work week. Those are just two examples. That's the only question I get as an interviewer. And then I'm going to have a conversation with you as the candidate around that question. I believe that the behavior-based interviewing question that I tee up in an interview is analogous to the tip of an iceberg. And that is, it's the first question. And then I'm going to have a conversation with you for the next, 3 to 5 minutes, let's just say. And I'm going to ask you a whole bunch of follow-up questions. Mm-hmm. And if I feel like you're overly scripted, I'm going to dive into that a little bit more. Mm-hmm. If I feel it's a little bit canned, I'm going to come at you with some additional follow-up questions, just really to poke and prod around that behavior.
Sure.
I mean, Jordan, underneath this competency, and it's hard to explain within a podcast, but underneath the competency, there are what DDI calls key actions. And so for one particular competency, there may be 3 to 5 different key actions that one needs to explain within an interview. Right. My gut says that I can smell when somebody's overly scripted, but if you're overly scripted and that example is a true example of behaviors you demonstrated in the past, I don't think that's a bad thing. React to that.
No, I like that. And that's been kind of my response a lot of times is like, okay, so they had a good answer. How deep did you dig? Yeah. Did you keep asking questions? Because one of the best area VPs that I work with, that's one of my clients, I can think of her right now. And I have placed many people with her in her organization. That is just the tip of the iceberg when she asks the question. Then there's a lot more follow-up questions and going to dig in and really be able to tackle. Because a lot of people, I think, that just have a surface level response are going to, in the end, we're going to get down to the brass tacks with that and find out what's actually going on. And that's not meant that it's overly intrusive or intimidating or anything like that, but it's just a follow-up question. And then what action did you take? Okay, and after that, after you did that, then okay, so what happened when this challenge popped up? And it becomes, off just a few questions that are absolutely key. Like you said, knowing your key competencies or your success factors is essential. You don't have to ask every single question under the sun, but you need to ask the right questions for your organization. And that's when I think the interview really takes off, is the most important questions, the essentials getting asked and then dug into.
Mm-hmm.
Also, by having an organization interview using targeted selection, you're going to be able to paint a better picture to the candidate of what they're looking at for them to be successful in a job. I've always told any of my friends or past colleagues, when they go into an interview, you are also interviewing the company. You want to make sure that you're going to be successful, that you're going to make money, you're going to do well and thrive there. And so if a company is using targeted selection, that candidate is going to get a good idea of what's needed to be successful at this job, and if they can fulfill those competencies and those duties. Now, of course, not everybody's going to be perfect at every single one, but they're going to walk away with a clear idea of what this job is looking for and feel better about, okay, is this for me? Is this something that we're going to continue to move forward in? Or was that just out of my range?
I think something that you touched on early, very early, that I want to go back to is confidence for the interviewer. Confidence in making the hiring decision. It's one of the most subjective sort of things in business that you can find, that so many people engage in broadly. It's inherently a subjective process. And I feel like what your process does is it pares down the subjectivity and raises the objectivity meter quite a bit. And I think that allows hiring managers to make hiring decisions more confidently and probably more quickly, in a sense, too. Because I find that when they're not as confident about their process, the decision gets pushed out.
So I love that comment, and I very much appreciate the removing the subjectivity and adding more objectivity into it. I'm going to tell you a fast story without leveraging a client name. And I couldn't get away with this in 2023, but I probably did in the year 2000. I had a client, it was a pharmaceutical company, actually, hiring managers that they were putting them all through behavior-based interviewing. And the client was getting a tremendous amount of pushback from the frontline leaders because they had 15, 20 years of interviewing experience under their belt. And I basically said to the client, give me your 12 naysayers, because that's typically a classroom size that we would do back then, around 12 different folks. And I said, if they come out of this, and at the time, believe it or not, behavior-based interviewing was a 3-day program. Today, it's 2 half-day programs. But back in 2000, it was 3 days. And I said, if we come out of that 3-day program and your managers don't feel like this was a time well spent, I will not bill you. And so I had these people come to Pittsburgh. They went through the interview, and I had 12 people walk up to me basically after that training. And I was the lead facilitator. And they said, I wish I would have had this 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Which was really cool to see.
It is.
Because it does get at, let's figure out what those targets for success look like. What are those behaviors I'm looking for? Get everybody rallied around the same success profile. And I was going to add the extra comment to what you said around subjectivity versus objectivity. More often than not, our recommendation is that you have more than one interview in the process.
Sure.
Any given job, Jordan, probably has, let's just call a medical device salesperson. I would probably put that somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 different competencies that I would put into that success profile for that individual. Every competency, just to get under the hood a little bit, in an interview, we say takes about 7 to 10 minutes to gather 2 to 3 stars per competency. What that basically means is I want to keep you on the phone for about an hour and get at around 6 competencies per interview. I want to then bring somebody else in, if I'm the hiring manager, and rely on them to gather the other 6 competencies. More often than not, I'm probably going to bring in a third interview, and then we're going to do data integration across the board. The reality is I have to rely on my peers to gather the right examples and stars and be calibrated around the scores for those competencies. And now you truly are removing much more subjectivity and allowing the data to drive the decision versus how I felt because I interviewed you one-on-one. I'm the only decision maker. And that to me is another one of those built-in processes that minimizes the adverse impact that we're hearing a lot about in today's world, removes some of the unconscious bias, another big word that we're hearing about today, and allows the data to drive the decision-making process as opposed to your personal opinions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me ask you, let's flip the script just for a second to a candidate perspective. I'm a candidate in med device sales or wannabe. I'm listening to this podcast and I'm saying, okay, if I'm going to benefit from listening to this, how can I adapt or incorporate these principles from targeted selection into my process as I go about interviewing with companies? Because I'm not necessarily going to know the difference between the competency or success factors at J&J versus a Stryker versus a Medtronic or a Boston Scientific or you name it. I don't know those. I don't work at that company. I can try to do some research. But how can people begin to interview this way, even just listening off to this podcast and maybe better themselves as a candidate?
I'm going to take the first shot at that question, and then I'm going to see if Alexandra has anything to add to it. So my first reaction is this. What makes you successful, candidate? Why are you good in your job? Back in my early day in the pharma world, I don't know if this word still exists, but it was about a brag book that's still around.
Yeah, somewhat. It's on its last breath in a lot of organizations, but yes, it exists.
Well, I'm dating myself with that comment, but that's okay. I'm fine with that.
No, there's still folks asking for them. There's no doubt.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think I had to have one a couple years ago, so they're definitely still out there.
I would say maybe not the brag book per se, but verification of success. That's what people want to see now.
Yes.
Yep.
So let's just use that for my own brain and say this. What made you successful in the job? I don't think I need you as a candidate to be savvy in all the different competencies that you need. But if I just rattled off a couple of scenarios, I think a lot of the folks listening to this would say, yeah, that makes sense. And that is, you probably need to have some sort of understanding of what your overall portfolio of clients looks like. And then how do you manage your portfolio and how you spend your time during that week? Once you get under the portfolio management, it's about account planning then. So for each individual account within your portfolio, what are you doing to make them successful? How much business savvy do you need to have? How much technical knowledge do you need to have? How well do you build networks with others? What do you do well when it comes to persuasion? How do you handle a difficult conversation when you're dealing with procurement? Just start thinking about the different behaviors you demonstrate on the job on a daily basis and what makes you successful, and start to just jot down stars, just examples of what you've done. What was the situation? How did you handle that in this situation? And what was the result? Just coming prepared for what makes you successful and having some stories ready, I think, is step 1 and 2 to becoming successful in an interview.
I love that. I really agree.
And to go off of that, 2 points that I would really recommend, especially for those medical reps. So first and foremost, do your research. Most of the time on the job description, you might see a couple competencies listed, especially with what's needed for the job. Usually it's at the end and it'll list it out of what you need to do to be successful in this job. So always do your research and then stay flexible because I think in medical sales, it can sometimes get easy to get into that everyday routine. I have a lot of really good friends that are still in the industry. And I don't want to say you go with the motions, but a lot of the time it's you're calling on the same physicians, you're talking about the same device, the same medicine. And if you're looking to make a jump or to be promoted, you need to be flexible and ready to learn new tasks because you can't stay in the everyday routine if you're going to continue to grow your book of business or to grow your resume.
Yeah.
So stay flexible, do your research before going into the conversation. And by doing your research, just like Mike had mentioned, that's when you can develop some of those stars ahead of time because you might already have an idea of some of the instances they might want to ask you about. So just have a couple in your back pocket.
Right.
One thing you mentioned earlier, Jordan, was if you have all of these already prepared, then how does that look if you're over prepared? Be genuine. I mean, at the end of the day, like I mentioned, you're interviewing the company as well. So just come in, show your personality, be genuine, and everybody just wants to see your actual personality and have a good conversation. And then that's really how you're going to do the best in your interview.
Yeah. One thing that I think that you probably both would agree with is you're not hurting yourself as a candidate to prepare to interview this way, even if they don't interview this way, because they may just ask you certain questions on the left side of the column, like you said earlier, Mike, but you've got more than that. And I think a candidate, and I know this because I've told candidates to prepare themselves to talk about success examples and things like that. They're more confident and they do better and they're ready to go. And they actually give a little more in the interview process than even the interviewer was expecting them to.
Oh, absolutely. And it's always, if you go into an interview and you can speak to a couple of the company's products or say something that you found interesting, whether it be an article that you saw online or a blog post, I mean, that their ears perk up immediately. And that just shows that you've already put yourself one step ahead of some of those other candidates that might have walked in there that day.
Yeah. Hmm.
I was going to ask Allie a question here, and I think I'm right when I say this. You guys have both heard the cobbler's kids have no shoes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we practice what we preach here at DDI. And so I was not a part of the recruiting process for Allie, but my understanding is that our recruiters would literally get on the phone with a potential candidate and go, hey, here's what you can expect in this interview. And so we want our candidates to bring their best self forward. And I'm going to assume that many of the clients that we train and deal with, that they do the same thing. And so I would hope that in the process, the candidates walk in and sort of eyes wide open around what to expect in an interviewing process.
Absolutely. How long does it take to get proficient as a hiring manager at STAR interviewing or at targeted selection?
It was a great question. So I'll share my 2 cents here. The process itself, the 2 half-day training programs are very heavy in skill practicing. What I don't want to see happen for a client is them to go through training and then get put in front of a candidate the very next day and not feel comfortable, because as Allie said earlier, these candidates are interviewing us as much as we are interviewing them. So I want to make sure that the hiring manager is on point. It's our belief that through the skill practicing process, you can come into a training, see what great looks like, practice it, get feedback from a facilitator, adjust whatever you need to adjust as a result of the feedback, and be prepared soon after to go out and do interviews successfully. I don't want to say this is not rocket science. It's not simple, but it's not rocket science either. And so my experience has been that if I can take the old assess, acquire, and apply model, assess what an individual needs, I need to help in becoming a better interviewer, acquire that skill, go through some training and some skill practice and get feedback, then go and apply it on the job soon. My experience has been that if I can move from acquire to application quickly, that one can move from the training class into the interviewing process and be successful quite quickly. Don't get me wrong, though. I think you get better over time. And that means understanding what those competencies are and how to ask better follow-up questions to really get at the heart of a STAR, to get at the heart of a competency. But I do think you can be successful quite quickly as a result of a thorough training process.
Sure. There are organizations that have kind of built this competency in where they put them through training, and I know it's with your organization, and then they send them off to interview as many junior military officers as possible at one of those JMO roundups that a couple companies put out. And in the course of 2 days, they might interview, 5 to 8 people each day or more. And so they're just hammering down. And I think that's one of the ways that potentially, if you don't get exhausted, that you can get proficient fairly quickly.
Totally agree with that statement. And there's a couple of tips and tricks that I've learned across my tenure. And one of them is, go back to the story I told you earlier about the 12 hiring managers. I think most of them could walk out of that room and be successful the very next day.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a newly promoted frontline leader that's in that hiring role for the very first time, I've often recommended a panel interview approach. And there's a whole bunch of different ways, Jordan, you can do this.
Yeah.
You can do it one way where, hey, I'm going to be the lead facilitator. I'm going to ask all the questions and follow-up questions. I just need somebody to take better notes for me. Because you go into one of those examples you just gave, Jordan. I did 5 interviews. At the end of the day, if I don't take good notes and I come back up at the end of the day after back-to-back-to-backs, they all kind of bleed together without good notes. And so we actually spend some time talking about the importance of note-taking and capturing the behaviors and how you do that to make sure that when you're in a situation like that, you can be successful a day or two later. So a panel interview approach sometimes can be a really good approach in terms of I'll lead, you note-take. I've also seen it be successful where I'll take these 3 competencies, you take these 3 competencies, and we'll just focus on our own and allow that second interviewer to be a second set of eyes and ears to ask any kind of follow-up questions if I may have missed something. So there's different things you could do for the more junior interviewer to get them more comfortable and up to speed faster.
Mm-hmm. What are some common mistakes that you tend to see interviewers making that have been, sort of received this training?
So there's a document out there that DDI has, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head right now. One of them is the halo effect that we say, which is I get on the phone with you or I'm live and you hit it off with somebody early on and all of a sudden now you just like them, but the examples aren't there. So you can't let that halo effect sort of blind your judgment along the way.
Mm-hmm.
You can't let the candidate control the interview to ask you a lot of follow-up questions. You are there as an interviewer to help pull the right behaviors out. You can't make a decision based on one interview. And if you're only covering half the competencies, how do you make sure that you allow the data to drive some of the decision-making process and trust your peers who are also doing interviews?
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you a real story that may even accentuate that point a little bit. We had a candidate years ago that myself and two of my peers interviewed, and it was for a project manager role. And one of the key competencies was planning and organizing. But this individual did not have a ton of experience in the workplace. They were a recent college grad. And so I interviewed this individual, and on a 5-point scale for planning and organizing, I gave her a 2. And that was a big deal to me because this was going to be a key part of the job. Well, interestingly enough, the other 2 interviewers came back, and this because it was one of the key competencies. We actually interviewed this candidate around this behavior 3 different times. All 3 of us, believe it or not, scored this person a 2.
Okay.
And when we calibrated, we did not automatically default to a 2. She actually became a 4. The reason is when you're gathering stars, we're coming at this candidate and we literally gathered 6 different examples from her, all coming at the same behavior, different ways. And what we got from this candidate was 6 unique examples that were all average. But if you think about that now, I've got this recent college grad that doesn't have much work experience that has multiple experiences around planning and organizing. And when you put them all together, you went, that's a lot better than I thought. And so you can't let your just one example dictate how you feel about that. You got to bring everything to the table and integrate. I've actually seen an example where I interviewed somebody and scored them a 4 on a 5-point scale, and my peer interviewed scored them a 2. And we ended up scoring them as a 2 overall because the one example they got that was so negative actually was enough to pull this candidate down. So that's another example around allowing the data to help drive the final decision-making process and avoiding that halo effect.
And to that point too, it's one of those, like the old saying, practice makes perfect. I mean, the more you are actually practicing the targeted selection teachings in your actual interviews, you're going to get more successful and it's going to become second nature to you.
You've got the essentials. You know the kind of conversation you should have. It doesn't sort of wander all over or meander all over the place, going off gut feelings. You've got specific data that you've gathered, and you've kind of got the roadmap of the way you want to go in your hiring process, which is resulting in an outcome people are going to feel good about. And they're going to feel good about also that someone was fairly treated, which is, that's sort of the whole package right there.
100% agree. Jordan, there's another point that I want to make around your question, and that was, when I'm doing these interviews with candidates and I'm gathering all these examples, understanding the motivational fit and organizational fit of this candidate back to my company is important as well. And there's a really easy way to go about doing this. You ever heard that old example of people don't leave companies, they leave leaders?
All the time. In fact, I use it.
Yeah.
I use it all the time. It's a weapon.
So in my mind, I need to understand the fit of this individual. Just because you gave me a great example of planning and organizing, I want to know also, what did you like about that? What did you dislike about that? Because planning and organizing within this current role could be different from what they're doing in their current role. And so there's another common mistake that people fail to do in an interview process, which is basically checking in on the motivational fit and job fit as a result of these stars that you gather throughout the way. Because somebody may say to somebody, I really don't like deep planning and organizing. But then when you hear the details of the example of why not, maybe it's around the minutia planning that has to happen on a regular basis, where in this particular job, you're not caught in the weeds. You're doing something different. You're now a frontline leader that you just need to understand things at a high level. And so asking some follow-up questions in an interview process around likes and dislikes, I think, is another key point where some leaders fail to really demonstrate that behavior in the interview process.
Well, I'll tell you, that sparks another thought, which is when we talked before this, I mentioned that all this insight you gain into the candidate, let's say you ultimately hire them. Now you've got, instead of putting that on a shelf and saying, yeah, we interviewed Bob back in the day and yeah, glad we hired him, he's a good rep. You now have a tremendous amount of insight into this person as well, which as you onboard them and as you coach them and as you develop them, DDI's got some suggestions and tools for you on that as well, I think. Is that right?
100%. And I'm going to let Allie speak a little bit to that as well. But I will make this comment. In my early career, so let's just talk about the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a number of organizations that I work with that spent a great deal of time and dollars with DDI around talent acquisition. I also had a handful of clients that spent a lot of dollars with DDI around talent development. But my quest as a consultant was to find that 50-50 client, the organization that would spend money with us on talent acquisition and then take that data to help drive the onboarding and development. And it's scary to say this out loud, but the truth was I had a lot of acquisition clients and a lot of development clients, but not a lot of 50-50. And that was what I thought that my job was going to be. That's what I made my job out to be, which was how do I close that gap? What happens in some of these larger organizations is that talent acquisition sometimes doesn't even talk to talent development. And that scares me. So my job in sales and in consulting is to bring those two worlds together, because you hit the nail on the head. The reality is all of this data that you're gathering, whether it be through a resume screen or through an interview or through a sales simulation, should absolutely be packaged and used to then onboard and develop that person. And I'll let Allie go into some details, but I'll give you one really good one that I think is an important one to make my point. When I build out selection systems for frontline leaders, I often have told my clients, sure, let's go ahead and interview around one of the key competencies of delegation, because as a frontline leader, you need to learn how to give up things and get things done through other people. But I'd say that 99 times out of 100, individual contributors that are moving into a frontline leader don't know how to delegate because they never had an opportunity to demonstrate that behavior as an individual contributor. And so I take delegation, I drop that on my decision criteria to a lower on the scale that says, don't expect people to be great, but get a read on it. And then let's make sure when we onboard frontline leaders, that becomes a skill and a behavior that we train within the first 6 months, because I don't expect them to be strong there.
Well, and that's where it comes to where onboarding, there's going to be specific things that you need to know in order to play out this role. However, everyone's onboarding is going to look a little bit different, because you need to, based off the data that you've been able to get from doing the targeted selection interviews, you can then look at that and say where a candidate might be having strengths at and maybe a little bit of weaknesses. So we need to help develop them so that they can be successful at that. And so by having a successful interview, you can then come into a role and you can help to have a candidate flourish in different competencies that maybe they hadn't proven in an interview. So that's where, for instance, being in a sales role, we're all about prospecting, and you need to get out there and, get in front of different clients. And so if you can successfully show in an interview, maybe through a star, how you've been able to show that in the past, then when you're in your onboarding process, they might be able to tell you, oh, you like that story you mentioned, this is how you can do this here. And also you could almost become the champion at different things at a new organization if you're vocal and say ways that you've been successful at other organizations previously.
Yeah. And what I really like too, it's sort of customized to the new hire that you just got as a manager. And it's a really interesting thing being a recruiter. And, when you talk to lots of different sales reps or sales support people across the country, you'll talk to a rep that's very successful and say, okay, so, just curious, how's your manager? How's your relationship with your manager? And they'll say, great. I never hear from them at all, ever. And I always kind of think, that's interesting. And I wonder either that person has a lot of other things on their plate, or maybe they don't know what to do with this person who's wildly successful and they just stay away because they don't want to mess it up. And they're just like, okay, the best way to manage them is just to leave them completely, totally alone. But then I come along, and because the manager's really not adding much value to that person, there's an open door there to have a conversation with them about something else, where maybe there's a manager that wouldn't be intimidated by them, but would actually be able to add value to their life professionally, right?
Yes. And that's so funny you say that, because in medical sales, we used to say there's no right or wrong way to do the job. We're all doing it in different ways, but we're all finding success in our own ways. Well, you should be. And so that's why, we would do the ride-alongs, or you would do, we used to joke, we have our phone friends, because you would have so much drive time. So you would talk with others in different territories and bounce ideas off one another and say, oh, I've had this hard situation. How did you overcome this? Or what are you doing to get in front of somebody that's a tough physician? And so, as you mentioned, some people, I think they believe that no news is good news. However, you can't grow in your position if you aren't getting the proper management, and you need that support at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And that is going to be a whole nother discussion, because I would love to have you both back. If you would like to come back, I hope you do.
Yes.
And talk about onboarding and development and continuing to leverage these insights that you've gained from the interview process for someone that you ultimately hired. But 2 quick questions before we go. How can people get access to this? And who is someone they could contact if they wanted to learn more?
Yes. So here at DDI, we have really listened to what's popular out there, how the workplace is evolving. So we have moved into a subscription method of unleashing our materials. So with that being said, I know we all have Netflix. There's certain people who have subscriptions to get their hair cut. I mean, everything is running on a subscription nowadays, it almost seems. So that is actually typically how we unleash our product to an organization. So we know that whenever you hire a candidate, as it's been mentioned throughout this interview, that not everyone is going to be a rock star in every competency that they're hired for. However, here at DDI, we can help develop them. You've invested in these candidates. We want to make sure that we get them the proper tools and support that they need to continue to be successful at the organization. And therefore, you're not going to have that revolving door. They're going to stick around. So the more you put into your colleagues, the more they're going to be happy and stay at the organization. So we do a subscription method here to unleash the targeted selection content as well as our development tools. So if anyone's interested in learning more regarding DDI's content, they can contact me at alexandra.center@ddiworld.com or reach out to me on LinkedIn, find me Alexandra Center, and I'd be happy to connect and always do a virtual call to introduce them to our offerings.
Perfect. Mike, Alexandra, thank you for being on today. This was fantastic.
Not too scary for the first one, Jordan. Thanks. Appreciate it. It was fun.
Great to have you both on.
Thank you for having us. It's been really fun.
Thank you for joining us on the Chase Medsearch podcast. I hope that you gained some helpful insight from today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, and give us a like on your favorite streaming platform. It really helps grow our audience. For more information on Chase Medsearch, visit our website at chasemedsearch.com. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, I'm Jordan Chase, and this has been the Chase Medsearch podcast.